Oh no, you were the bad guys all along. Welcome to House of Bards. We are a podcast about shared narrative in role-playing games, the sort of airy-fairy, wishy-washy end of the tabletop role-playing spectrum, and how that is really fun.
Mm-hmm.
So this week we are going to talk about villains, bad guys, rotten sods,
Dirty, rotten scoundrels.
antagonists in general.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we start with villains?
I mean,
honestly?
I think there's an important distinction to make between mechanical villains and narrative villains. Because mechanical villains are, this would be a cool monster to fight, and narrative villains are, what we're going to be talking about a bit more, probably.
In that they actually get all the gears of the actual antagonism of the antagonist,
Yeah.
like running.
Uh-huh. Like a Tarask is a neutral creature. It's not evil by any means, but it is a mechanical villain because they're
I
formidable
think
villains.
that really comes under the heading of a monster.
Yeah.
Which
Well,
that sometimes that can bleed into villains mechanically, but I think really what we're talking more about is sentient, generally sapient beings who, for some reason, are attempting to antagonize or work against the heroes of the story, which in this case would be the party.
Yeah.
And who those people could be,
Mm-hmm.
what their motivations are, and what their powers could be.
And even, players listening, if you could be one.
Yes, that is also a thing that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about player characters as antagonists. Should be fun. So, what motivates a villain? I think there are a number of things, and it depends on how far you want to go into this. Something I think that we would encourage as part of shared narrative is that in order for your players really to have the freedom of the narrative itself has to stand up, which means that complex villains who antagonize for internally consistent reasons, rather than like Saturday morning cartoon villains, will often be better if you're going to set them up over a long period of time. Because then your players have a lot of options about how to interact with that character, rather than like, say for instance, they can't be reasoned with because their motivation doesn't actually make any sense.
Yeah, they need to have. They kind of, in a weird way, they kind of need to create sometimes, not all the time, a bit of conflict between the party. I think those are really good villains, but it can be difficult to strike that unless you're tailoring a villain specifically for the party.
Yeah, I think so. When we talk about motivations for villains, obviously the most obvious one is like just a general sense of evil.
Yeah, like evil for its own sake.
Yeah, which is not incredibly deep. You're not going to go very far with a villain like that. There is one notable exception, and I will probably talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
But honestly, when it comes down to it, most villains don't think that they're villains.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of evil characters don't actually think that they're evil.
They think that, they're doing good, or they're doing something that's good, or it might not be a completely
even in cases where they do think that they're evil, generally they will think that they have become evil for a reason that
justifies
can't be changed.
Yeah, the means justify the end.
Yeah, or even this is I'm so bad, but it's because of this thing, and now I'm completely disillusioned with stuff. Everybody is evil, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like you don't often get like evil people who will admit that they are evil people, because nobody really does that. People have intentions that are inherently either good or what they believe can be good.
Yeah. Like, even the biggest shitheads in the world will always try and justify and rationalize their evil actions. That's what you do. And if you can't rationalize them, then
you've presumably probably thought about that before you did them, and then you don't do them. So when you get beyond that point, the next most obvious motivator is hate.
Yeah.
Like, hate is honestly almost as base as evil, and the only real difference is that hate does actually turn up as a motivator for people we would consider villains in real life.
Yeah.
It's not the only motivator for such people, but
No.
you think, like, there are a number of historical figures who are seen to have been motivated by hate and have done things that are very in keeping with what we consider a villain to be.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is it's good for setting up an environmental villain.
Yeah.
Like a villain whose villainy, or like a country maybe, or a faction whose opposition to other maybe more amiable factions or people is already established. Like, hate's good for that, but it honestly, you can't take it anywhere.
Yeah. Like, villains who have hatred as their motivation, they're good for world building because you can show this sort of a person has prejudices against this type of
Yeah,
people. Like,
absolutely.
in
But even
Shadowrun.
then, you're gonna run into like world building places where you're going to want to explain why.
Yeah.
So it's difficult for this to remain as base as it really seemed it would be.
Yeah.
But like, I think if you want to go for a very simplistic plot with a very simplistic villain, you should pick hatred as a motivator.
Yeah.
Because well, think why do we keep making games and films and literature set in the Second World War?
Because, like, well, the Nazis are, I suppose, one of the closest real life examples we're ever going to get to true evil.
Yeah, that's the closest we can get to like black and white morality,
Yeah.
where you can look at this concept of like, state fascism and just aggressive expansionism, and you think this is not good
Yeah.
for anybody we can relate to in this situation.
Mm.
And it's also not like irrelevant to anybody we can relate to in this
Yeah.
situation. It would be almost comically like cliche were it not a thing that actually happened. So I think that kind of thing does show that it will simplify the story a lot if you can remove the potential for interference in the motivations of your villain, and if that's the case, then you should choose hatred, just because it's easy. But what are some other motivators?
Money.
Greed. Greed is one. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Um, Greed is arguably also a motivator for villains that turns up a huge amount in real life.
It's not incredibly interesting. Mostly because it does get used a lot, and we've retread it a lot. And
honestly, the only thing that makes greed more interesting than hatred as a motivation is that it's fluid.
yeah.
It's not absolute, because it's not wrong for humans and human analogs to want to acquire resources,
No.
especially if they don't have any.
Yeah.
Like, that's what poverty is.
Yeah.
So you have to try and look at that and see where the barrier point is between being self-sufficient and amassing resources for the sake of taking them away from other people.
Like we would generally agree there is, once you get most working most non 1%ers.
Oh yeah, by the way,
would
this
agree.
is probably going to get like a lot heavier than the album image that I have chosen might imply, just because we're going to have to get into talking like a conversation about why people do bad things, which is not completely irrelevant to the real world as it stands and politics and whatnot.
Yeah. Anyway, we would agree that, the majority of, working class and maybe even middle class folks, and maybe even some upper class people, if you're listening, would agree that there is an amount of money that is enough, right? And when you have enough money, wanting more than enough money is a bit greedy.
I think maybe it works better to model it as a relationship between the person and their environment. But yes, like that amount will probably be fluid, but there is probably a threshold at which you become financially stable.
Yeah, like we would agree that, a billionaire probably doesn't need any more money than what they already have.
When you get to the point where you are starting to you're trying to find contrived ways to spend your money, possibly you have amassed too much money. So yeah, greed is definitely a motivator. It's generally a pretty safe one to do narratively, because even those of us who do practice it generally are aware that it's wrong. And actually, something that's relevant to this, I was asked a while ago, do you think it is possible for an evil country as portrayed in systems like D&D actually to exist? And I was like, well, cosmic forces that govern our morality don't exist. So how would you define a country that considers itself evil? And what I eventually came up with was, well, it would have to be a nation that teaches some principle as a fundamental tenet, but then has an entire culture devoted to contravening that principle. And then I thought, oh shit, it's us. Because you're taught like all the time in school and as a kid and like in a lot of our media that greed is wrong.
Yeah.
And we're given pretty decent examples of what it constitutes.
Yeah.
And yet we do it all the time.
Oh yeah.
In huge amounts. Like it's a major problem.
It's not even just like the UK, but I immediately, think, wow, many other countries in the world.
Yeah.
I mean,
I wasn't limiting it to just us. I think there's quite a number of countries that have this issue.
Absolutely. Like, I'm not going to name any because some of them are very powerful and have spies everywhere. America. And I'm not gonna put myself out there.
Well, it's you not saying it, not me.
Yeah.
So what else is there? Well, I think beyond that you have control. Control as a motivator is very, very, very fluid because it can mean a huge number of different things. It can key into greed. Like there have been suggestions that a lot of greed-based villains also work as control-based villains just because the reason why they amass huge amounts of resources is because they are made uncomfortable by the lack of control associated with lesser forms of wealth.
Yeah.
Which is honestly something that they should probably work on in their own time rather than just depriving everybody else of the resources that they need. But that's what makes them a bad guy.
Yeah. Like I'm kind of thinking about like the Kingpin from Daredevil. Like if you've read the comics, he's normally his primary motivation tends to be monetary greed, and I need this money because. And then when you get into the Netflix TV series, it's purely about control and being able to control the sort of chaotic nature of Hell's Kitchen and their denizens, therefore. And it's about, I need to have control of this. And it makes sense with this character's backstory of why maybe he wants a lot of control in his life because he didn't have it when he was younger.
Yeah, well, a lot of the motivation for, well, a lot of the foundation of a control-based motivation is some kind of consequence that might arise or is believed that it might arise from the lack of control. I'm not actually really comfortable thinking of like real life analogs of this, but
fair enough.
Dictators and people like that. You might be able to think of specific dictators from history who might have had a problem with this. Is that kind of thing? And I think that kind of ties in to probably, I think, the most nuanced motivation, which is fear. I love fear-based villains because they are so relatable. You can look at them and you can see exactly how that person has become a villain, which is sometimes difficult to do with villains with other motivations.
Yeah.
For instance, in Dawn Somber, both Galliena and Torak are fear-based villains, and they're also control-based villains.
Yeah.
Because there's a very strong connection between those two things. So, as a background, Captain Torak was some horrible creature from the deep, disguised as a sea captain who was getting a load of undead, drowned individuals and marrow and sharkmen, whatever, to attack Port Thomas, the floating pirate city in Dawn Summer. You will remember this, Beth.
I do remember this, yeah.
And you guys killed him pretty quick, so it was possibly difficult for you to
get
a hold of what it was that was his reason for doing that. But basically, what happened was that there was a sect of the mer people who had gained the ability to see the future, And what they were afraid of was that Port Thomas was like the first floating city of its type. And they were like, we absolutely have to make sure that this doesn't become a thing.
Yeah.
Because control of the sea is going to be taken away from us. It'll be the like herald of just a continual cycle of abuse of the sea and stuff like that. So they were afraid of losing control and determination over their environment. Similarly, Galliena wants to do some pretty fucked up things,
Mm-hmm.
but she has a fear-based reason for wanting to do them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Galliena is the first elf in thousands of years to have control of the old magic, and she is sometimes heralded as like an anomaly, and sometimes as like the first step, the missing link to the elves regaining the power over the old magic. And she's like, I don't think this is something that elves as a whole are ever going to stop wanting, and I am terrified of the consequences of them getting it.
Mm.
So, like, she decides, like, there's nothing else I can do. I have to murder all the elves in the world,
Mm.
including myself.
Yeah.
But, like, that is a extreme response, but it's still a fear-based one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because, like, it's not, she's not doing that thing for personal gain. She's doing it to avert what she perceives as a terrible consequence of not doing it. And I think that kind of villain is the easiest to understand, because I think a fear-based villain is the kind of villain that each and every one of us could most likely become.
Yeah.
As soon as you're like in a position where there is something you are deathly afraid of happening and you have the power to prevent it, then you're running into a position where you're very quickly going to come to maybe understand that some extreme idea that you thought of might be justified. And it's very dangerous. It happens to real people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not actually comfortable talking about real life examples of that either, but
No.
some of the sharper of you might pick up what I'm alluding to here. I do intend to maybe talk about that more somewhere else. I don't
Yeah.
know. Spite
Oh,
is
yeah.
is a motivation for if your villain is merely an unpleasant. This doesn't work for like really big villains, but for
I
just a
would.
minor antagonist, spite is excellent. You'll remember if you listened to the last episode that Joseph Navybeard was not really a villain, but he was an antagonist to Dragax because out of basically spite over being upset, he was like, "Well, I'm not gonna help you at all.
Yeah.
I'm not going to hinder you, but I'm not going to give you the information that you need. Even though now that you've told me this thing, I have basically no reason to like be silent, other than the fact that I don't like what you're doing."
If you're gonna make spite a motivation for a major antagonist, look at Maleficent from the Sleeping Beauty movie, because you've got to go like balls to the wall. You've got to make sure that they are the master evil overlord of everything, and that like the only reason they're doing it, that like the only reason they haven't leveled the kingdom before now is because they've never had a reason to, basically, until the king doesn't invite you to the christening of his daughter.
Look also at 11 and 12-year-old Draco Malfoy.
Yes. Although I would argue there was another little different motivator in there, but yeah, spite, definitely.
Yeah, yes,
Particularly
Beth. We
towards
all
Ron
know
Weasley.
about your theories about the motivations of Draco Malfoy. But yeah, I think like when the stakes are pretty low in like the first two books, Draco Malfoy is a pretty good example of a spite-focused villain.
Yeah,
Just because a lot of the stuff that he does is incredibly petty,
yeah.
but he
It
does
is.
it
He's really
because
petty little shit, doesn't he? It's
yeah. And I think the biggest problem you're going to run into with making spite-based villains like big bads is that they're going to be petty.
yeah,
They're probably going to be like really pathetic people,
yeah,
just because that's not a great. As a motivator, it doesn't scale well
yeah,
unless the person is just really pathetic.
yeah. You've got two choices with spite motivated villains. You've got Draco Malfoy at 11 or Maleficent, and there's no real in between.
Yeah. Now, there are a couple more motivations that at least we can think of, which I did think about not mentioning, but I suppose if somebody else thinks of them and tries to bring them up, it might be good to shoot them down now. A motivator that a lot of people use, particularly for chaotic evil villains, is insanity.
Yeah.
The thing is, like, as a podcast made by two neuroatypical people, we're not really going to recommend that you do that. I know I definitely wouldn't.
I mean, even I would argue in comic books, especially in Batman comic books, the reason it's so overused is due to sort of that weird grimdark period that happened in the 80s where Batman became sort of dark and grim, which is fine. But before then, the Joker, who I think is a shining example of this trope of evil equals insanity, is he was more a playful comedic villain, and his gains were more monetary, and he was just a wacky clown-themed villain. And then obviously the 80s happened, and he shot Barbara Gordon and killed Jason Todd, and lots of other horrible things. And it was sort of like he kind of crossed the moral event horizon, and they went, okay, well, why is he doing this then? And it kind of became more about his obsession with Batman and his sort of apparent lack of morality and his kind of antisocial disorder tendencies, which is unfortunate. And then all of the bad guys in Gotham were inexplicably insane. Even Bane, who totally has legit normal reasons for what he does.
Yeah, it's concerning.
Yeah.
The thing is, real talk for a moment. If you're going to use this as a villain motivation, you are stigmatizing the mentally ill.
You are, yeah.
Like, there's no nuance between those two concepts. They are the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not really going to support you in doing that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And I mean, there are ways you can be sympathetic towards certain villains. Harley Quinn gets quite a lot of sympathy thrown on her because
Does not mean
she's essentially got bad person syndrome.
Yeah, I should have been more clear. This doesn't mean that you can't make a villain who is mentally ill and whose mental illness interacts with them having another separate villain motivation.
Yeah.
Like, because real people do that.
Yeah. Like,
it's just the whole thing of like, oh, they're crazy, so they do evil things. It's like, no. That is actually really, really harmful, and it creates weird false impressions in the public consciousness if you do it a lot. I imagine that you probably, as a DM somewhere, won't have a huge amount of media reach beyond like the 4 to 6 people at your table.
Yeah.
But it's still a habit it's good not to get into, because
be the change you want to see in the world, people.
It's also, the difficult thing about that kind of villain is that they are pretty much just as one-dimensional as, like, hatred-motivated villains, or even evil for evil's sake motivated villains. They're basically an excuse to get to evil for evil's sake.
Yeah.
And there is like a meta text there for what makes this scary as villainy is that we can't understand it.
Yeah.
But I feel that there are ways that that can be done that don't just spread weird lies about like illnesses and disabilities and neurotypes that people actually have and live with every day, and in the large majority are more likely to be victims of the depicted crimes than the perpetrators. Or rather than like mentally healthy people.
Yeah.
Which is fucked up. It's the exact wrong way around. But anyway, the other motivation that I have, which I think I would have a very similar warning for, is political extremism.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, this is good in that, like, it's one of the most believable villain motivators. Political extremism, honestly, I think keys into most of the people we would call villains in real life. Even like the hatred motivated ones or the spite motivated ones. Well, maybe not spite motivated ones, but like any villain on a large scale in real life is probably going to have some kind of political agenda. That said, and I get the feeling that quite a lot of you are going to figure out what I'm trying to say here, there is a difference between setting up a villain with an in-universe relevant politically extremist view that causes them to do evil things, and setting up an evil for evil's sake villain with a mask of like a really ham-fisted analogy for a form of political extremism in real life that you don't like.
Good
get what you're trying to do, but don't do that, because it makes the whole game really unfun for everybody.
Yeah. Don't get anvilicious, okay? especially if it's anvilicious with no good reason. But if some anvils need to be dropped, drop them. That
And
doesn't
other
make
things
any
that Beth
sense.
just says.
And anvil in this context means moral message or an Aesop.
Yeah, and it's kind of difficult in that, like, all art is inherently political, and
Yeah.
yours will be no exception, even though your audience is going to be tiny.
Yep.
But please don't do the thing where, like, your villain is like this really obviously like masked allegory for something that you
Yeah.
don't like in real life,
Yeah. Like,
especially if that thing would be controversial,
yeah.
unless you're actually prepared to unmask that and properly explore it. And I think you really have to have a very specific kind of party for that, who are all in on it from the start, because otherwise you're basically just introducing this controversial and uncomfortable subject into a public space where it doesn't belong.
Yeah. Um,
As far as like keeping your party together goes, I would not recommend doing that.
yeah. Like, I'm kind of reminded of that one really bad Powerpuff Girls episode with the like straw feminist character that even Lauren Faust regrets doing because the female character, the feminist quote unquote character in it makes like no sense. It's a super preachy episode. Even when I was watching it at 6, I was like, Lauren Faust, this is weird. And it,
It is super weird. Like, I'm very much unaware of like the actual content of this episode, but what
yeah,
little I have seen of what Beth's referring to, it is really weird.
yeah. And it, it's the people who've seen the episode will know the things I'm talking about, but it kind of, when you portray an almost utopian, unsexist society, and then you drop a straw feminist into it, she's always going to look like a straw feminist, basically, because what's she complaining about? Men and women are equal in this fictional society. So you've got to be careful with that.
Well, that's also something to think about. Do your villains' motivations actually make any sense
Yeah.
in the environment they exist in?
Uh-huh.
Like, I think that's the same problem that you're going to have with player characters.
Oh, yeah.
It's just from the other direction.
Mm.
But it's something that you as the DM will generally have control over. So it makes sense to have villains who maybe have political motivations based on what you've decided the politics of this universe are. Or maybe if you don't think there's any particularly aggressive politics in this universe, which, fair play to you, not everybody wants to deal
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
Maybe your villain has some kind of greed motivation associated with power, which
Yeah.
sort of, goes into everything comes back to power in the end,
It does.
basically.
I
Because
think.
even if power isn't your end goal, it's going to be the means to your end.
I think maybe, of course, with the exception of revenge. Revenge is a funny one because it can also be a heroic motivation.
This is true, but revenge also keys through power, because
It
obviously
does,
if
yeah.
you don't have the power to exact your revenge, then you aren't going to get anywhere.
And we're not necessarily talking always political power here.
No, we can talk about political power, we can talk about monetary power. In settings like this, we can literally just talk about, like, magical power.
Yeah.
Just straight stopping power.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Like if you're if this villain is a trained assassin who has been trained from birth and then got fucked over by the people who were training her and she decides to kill everyone and the heroes of the tale have to stop this trained assassin from killing everyone, that counts as power. The power to kill counts as a power.
Oh yeah, definitely. And the thing about power is that it's such a fluid concept. It describes relationships between people and
Yeah.
groups of people and the appropriate amount of. Let's talk about this in terms of Magic the Gathering.
Yeah.
There is a concept, not only in Magic the Gathering, but in basically all like related card games, called card advantage, where the basic idea is that having more cards in your hand than your opponent makes you more powerful, because you have, like, even if both of you are going to cast the same number of spells with like roughly the same like level of power, you have more options, and because you have more options, you're more able to like roll with what your opponent is going to do. So that's always better. And most power-based relationships are like that. It's not just straight mashing two forces of power together. It's also like the more things that I can do in relation to you and either stopping or eliciting what I particularly want you to do or not do, that's the more power I have. So yeah, that can be the thing. Because of that, any and all villains are going to have to interact with power at some point, even if it's not their end goal, even if it's the exact opposite of their end goal. They are going to have to like thread through it. And in many cases, it is their end goal. It's they just pick their particular brand of power that they want, and then they just go to try and accumulate it. So I said earlier that there was an exception in the kind of games that we're talking about to the evil for evil's sake villains. So I should probably explain what that is. I try to very much limit in Dawn Somber the concept of inherently evil beings. I don't like inherently evil beings. I especially don't like inherently evil beings who are inherently evil for apparently no reason. Like, a lot of older D&D settings will talk about, and Tolkien as well, from whom all of this stems. And if you actually go and look it up, you will find that Tolkien himself had misgivings about this concept. Orcs being inherently evil, which actually makes more sense in Tolkien's work than it does in a lot of his derivatives.
Yeah.
It's fucked up, and I don't like it. I especially don't like D&D orcs being inherently evil because in most cases they are just normal sapient beings.
Yeah.
There's nothing weird or spooky about their inherent evilness, or that of hobgoblins, or that of goblins. Now, I can believe that culturally they just tend to have a lot of maybe very violent motivations that are at direct odds with the people around them, and that just means that in general they're going to be evil. But the idea of them all inherently being evil really doesn't sit right with me. So the exception is when that being has been literally created to be evil.
Yeah.
Now, this obviously applies to robots
It does.
and other types of construct, and undead,
Mm.
obviously. Although not all undead, it will depend on the form of creation of the undead, but most undead, that will be the case. And also, in Dawn Somber, anything divinely created, I mean, not everything that's divinely created, but anything that is divinely created has the potential to be basically a vanilla block of a particular piece of morality, just because that was what it was created to do. And probably the biggest manifestation of this in Dawn Somber at the moment is the Dragon Triumvirate.
Yeah.
There's these three dragons. Unlike all other dragons except the first dragon ever, they were just created by Skedrenth, the god of dragons, to fuck shit up. And they are just all fuck.
Unquestionably.
Sure, whatever. They are just all evil in a slightly different way. Astronax is chaotic evil, Restorex is lawful evil, and Jakarax is neutral evil. But they are all single-mindedly devoted to the particular concept that drives them as evil. Like, they're never not going to be that. And I think that's the one out. If you have a being that is capable of creating other beings, then the other beings it creates can have just like blanket solid morality all the way through with no nuance. So that goes for gods, and it also goes for like anybody capable of creating constructs or robots or undead or whatever. That's fine. It's just the idea of like 'cause the thing is when you see those kinds of beings occurring in the wild, like wild orcs and hobgoblins, whatever, and you're just like, well, they're evil because they just are. That quickly ruins the verisimilitude for me because what becomes immediately apparent to me is that's bullshit. That would never happen. So we are seeing this story from a specific perspective.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what you're going for, but there are better ways to tell that story than from the word of the DM. Or at least from the word of the DM as presumed to be an objective view of the setting. I have never actually played any kinds of games in this setting, so I don't know exactly how much it holds up, but from what I've seen, I think Warhammer 40k is really on board with this. With the idea that you could have the game be from a very clearly wrong perspective that just sort of like blanket moralizes everything. And It looks really fun, actually, but it's quite obvious. You look at it and you're like, well, this is more nuanced than this, and the people with all the power are just sort of like forcing a square peg into a round hole to
Yeah.
keep it not nuanced. Which is very interesting. Like there is merit in playing a game like that, but I don't like it when it's just a sort of accepted thing that, oh well, orcs are inherently evil because they're orcs. And I'm like, well, why? I don't believe. Like sometimes I will play a character who wouldn't question that. Very often, I think I will play characters who, for a variety of reasons, would, as soon as they get to a point where it's not advantageous to them universally to kill these beings.
Yeah.
Like, there's an age-old question. It's like the baby goblin question. It's like, are baby orcs and goblins and whatever who don't really have any experience of the world inherently evil?
I mean, to me, especially in Dungeons and Dragons, once you throw in things like half orcs, it becomes a really grey area, because does that mean that in a world where orcs are inherently evil, humans then disrupt the evil gene?
Well, I think generally the way it's swung is that then they will actually collapse it back and say, no, it's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
And because half orcs are either like in one or culture or the other, then that culture will define what they believe, what they do. It's the same deal with half elves, even though it's not really related to morality there.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's basically I'm cool with the idea of having tribes of orcs and hobgoblins who can't be reasoned with because none of the things that they want are concessions that the people you consider the heroes can provide. That's fine. But to say, oh, they're evil just because they are, I'm like, well,
Yeah.
no. I think sometimes people will say, well, you're reading into this too much, and I'm like, well, maybe, but the thing about that kind of portrayal is that it instantly makes me uncomfortable because you know it's not true.
Yeah.
It's not true about anything, and it's actually been used in like really gross ways over history to just like stigmatize certain groups of people. And at the point where you look at that, you think this is propaganda.
Yeah.
So instantly, when that happens in a game, I'm like, wait, hang on, why the shit is there propaganda in my D&D?
Yeah.
Like these people aren't even real. Why am I getting
Yeah.
propagandized? The thing about propaganda in games is it's a cool storytelling tool, so the players should know when they're being propagandized to.
Yeah.
It's okay if the characters don't know, but the players should know because them being in on it is the important factor.
This is also, by the way, the reason Alex has a problem with Drow.
Yeah,
Which I
yeah,
believe we've talked about before.
there are
But,
no drow whatsoever in Dawn Somber because I'm like, no, that's gross. Please don't do that.
yeah.
I mean, there are other reasons. One of the other reasons being that I don't like the concept of the Underdark.
Yeah.
But no, it's like drow.
These dark-skinned, women-ruled elves.
Are they women ruled? I didn't know that.
Women-ruled, matriarchal, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, and
It
then they're
says in
just,
the...
the fact that they're all evil, and
Yeah.
there's one notable exception. It even says this in the fucking
It
player's
does.
handbook, and it's like you're just openly admitting that every single good drow is basically a Kirby,
Yeah.
and that does not sound fun to play.
No.
I mean, maybe in an evil campaign, but then you'd all probably be drow or Durgar because you'd be underground.
Yeah.
It's I don't like how lazy the drow are as
Yeah.
a concept, and I don't like how much Wizards keeps trying to like force it, and it gets more and more uncomfortable the more they like chip away at the unambiguous cartoonism of it all.
Yeah.
I don't know. I personally would love to see Wizards get rid of drow entirely,
I mean,
or at least merge drow into elves as a race.
yeah.
So
And
it's just that they're like
just be like, they have a bit of a different culture, guys. And that's okay.
it's fine if they live in a
Yeah.
different culture, and it's fine if that culture is like unpalatable to surface
Yeah.
elves, because that's a lot of stuff that does happen in real life.
I mean,
Certain people's cultures have things that you consider weird and maybe even scary.
yeah, I mean, there are places in the world where cannibalism, for example, is an accepted practice that people do. And
Hmm.
matriarchal societies are an accepted thing that people do.
There are some cultures in the world that would find cremation a concept that we generally do not have too much of a problem with, to be like utterly horrifying.
Yeah.
And being fair, that will generally tie into like religious practices involving
Yeah.
like the sanctity of the wholeness of the body and stuff like that. But it's not. Cultural difference is a good driving factor for antagonism, if not villainy.
Yeah.
But obviously, as I've said before, know what you're doing. Because if you take it too far, it's going to become like really weird and uncomfortable.
It's going to become racist.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I'm dropping it. It's not going to become weird.
If you really fuck it
racist.
up, it will definitely become racist. That will happen.
Yeah.
But also just like before you even get there, it's going to start becoming like people will be at the table like I don't really want to be telling this story.
Yeah.
This does not seem to be a fun thing to play.
Yeah.
Like these are real questions that are asked about real people's lives, presented in a proxy of like elves and orcs and whatever, and that's usually cool. But in this particular case, I don't know the answer, and that makes me scared.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that games should never touch on those kinds of subjects. I
Yeah,
know
but
that there's I can't remember the game in particular, but there is an extra credits episode about this that you should really watch.
yeah.
And what they go into is there's a supplement for the World of Darkness game Wraith
Mm.
that deals with some really, really fucked up shit. And it's fine if you want to have an environment to discuss that stuff, and obviously
Yeah.
your villains are going to be a lot more real in that
Yeah.
in that particular environment, because then you're getting really hard into the fact that there are no villains.
Mm.
There are just people who are prepared to do things for reasons that you don't agree with. And maybe you don't agree with the things either. I think what we're coming down to here, that there's no such thing as villains.
Yeah. Not really. No.
Not really. There are antagonists, and that's a better word for them because it doesn't imply anything about them.
Mm.
They just antagonize.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think generally I should. This is getting very dark. This will not generally be a problem. I am absolutely sure that you will be able to come up with a series of villains for your setting that will fit into the environment, who will have motivations that actually make sense in the setting that you've defined, and who generally like we've already laid out what are safe places to go.
Yeah.
Like hate, fear, if you want to be a bit edgy, control and greed are all cool. And for minor villains, spite is great as well. Like those are all great motivations, and they allow the. Well, here's the thing: why should a villain have a motivation?
Mm.
Generally, the reason why is because then once you know what motivates a villain, you know what that villain cares about,
Yeah.
what that villain is prepared to do in order to achieve their goals, generally.
Yeah.
And that means that you can improvise. You can make up what that villain is going to do
Mm.
as they react to the players interacting with them. And of course, for the kind of role playing that we like on this podcast, that's really important for
Yeah.
all characters. So obviously, villains are no exception.
I mean, a villain can have a perfectly reasonable motivation to a player character. Like, I don't know, I want to kill all the elves, for example. Because
Well, that was
I'm
the
afraid
thing
they
about
could use all
Galliena, was
magic.
that all four of you
Yeah.
had drastically different opinions about Galliena, what she wanted to do, why she wanted to do it, and what she was prepared to do in pursuit of it. It was really incredibly interesting that
It was, yeah.
that split the party entirely.
Yeah. You had Silas, who took a weirdly sympathetic approach, like
Silas wasn't sympathetic to
her motivations,
Galiena's
to her
motives, but
situation.
he was very sympathetic to her means.
Yeah.
Like basically, there was if you went into her story and just sort of lifted out the accumulation of power, like the methodology she'd worked out for that, he was on board with that.
Yeah.
Whereas Jay and Balasar were on like opposing sides of the question around her actual motivation, weren't they?
Yeah. When you have something like that, and you have a villain who actually relates very strongly to a character, it can be very easy to kind of see how your character could kind of go down a bit of a dark path and join up with the bad guys or align themselves with dark forces. Whether they agree with that villain exactly or they agree with a different villain who opposes that villain. Which, I mean, we haven't even gotten to battling villains, which is maybe a story.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think it's very relevant here because, of course, you get into the concept of, okay, villains don't exist, so that means there aren't like the good side and the bad side.
Hmm.
There are multiple groups of people with multiple different motivations that are going to clash all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's excellently represented in what you folks are currently doing
Yeah.
in
Which,
Varash with the multiple different factions. Um, so yeah, player characters as villains.
yeah. I mean, there's always starting out evil, obviously.
Starting out evil generally, I think, works best if you make that decision as a group at
Mm,
the beginning that the whole
yeah.
party is going to be evil and you're going to play an evil campaign.
Yeah. Although I did once play a game with someone who was evil, and and their character pretended to be good throughout the entire campaign. But that was something agreed with the DM, and when it was revealed, we all went, "Oh, what a twist!" And that's always incredibly interesting. Like, if you want to be a um, lying, evil person, like the DM will probably facilitate that. Because DMs love a good traitor. Like, I don't, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
that's an archetype, the spy
yeah,
of an in-party villain.
yeah,
I mean, the other archetype, of course, is just well, it's bad guys, isn't it?
yeah,
It's just a lot of you just singing that song from Bugsy Malone.
yeah.
Um, there's a there's a third one, I think, and this one is the hardest to pull off. I don't know what you would call it. Archetype, archetypically. Ugh.
Mhm.
Wow, I'm
Archetypically,
I'm having difficulty with words, with worms.
it is okay.
Um, but oh yeah, it's the you either die a hero type villain,
Mm. Or
where yeah, or
yeah,
you live long enough to see yourself become a villain. Where like this is maybe the deepest kind of player character villain because if you pull this off, there's no denying that your character is a character. Like they're an
yeah,
actual person with their own motivations within the fabric of the group. This is the kind of player character where at the start of the game you have no intention whatsoever in like the direction of making this character become a villain
yeah.
at all.
Just kind of
Like
happens that way.
you
Yeah,
but then you run into like means by which your character will interact with the environment around them, which will suggest to you this is maybe some kind of factor that would cause a lapse in your character's moral judgment
yeah,
or cause some kind of moral or political position that would be at direct odds to the party in question over a period of time. Like, I'm trying to think of examples of this trope, and all I'm getting is fucking Anakin Skywalker, who is a terrible example of it.
he
Like
is.
that
Yeah,
does happen to him. That totally does happen to him, but it's not a good representation of the story. It's like the fall from grace will generally happen if a character is focused on one particular thing and their focus on that thing takes them away from the rest of the party.
yeah,
This is totally doable, and in fact, I have seen this multiple times simultaneously in a certain D&D group that I could name after a particular event. Um, and that's I hesitate to call that the best way because the other two ways are also good.
mm,
Like those are legit things that can happen, but I think it's probably the hardest to pull off and the most impressive when you do
mm,
because then you're actually thinking not just about like playing the game and dungeoneering and just having your character essentially be an extension of yourself for interacting with the game world. You're actually thinking about who your character is, what they want, what motivates them, what they care about, and whether those motivations are still in line with the rest of the party.
heroic antagonist and villainous protagonist.
Yeah, that's totally a thing. I'm trying to think of examples of it.
Um, I was thinking think of D&D examples, but I mean there are plenty of comic books, video games, anime where you're seeing it from the perspective of the villain.
Oh, Captain Hammer and Doctor Horrible.
Yes, there we go. Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog is a really good example of that. And in a way, a really good because he's not really very evil
He's
towards
not
the
incredibly
start.
evil, no, and Captain Hammer is like kind of a dick,
Yeah,
but he still like tries to do evil things, and Captain Hammer still tries to do heroic things.
Yeah.
Which is probably like the perspective you would play it from if that happened.
Doctor Doom had a wonderful solo series called Doom 2099 in the 90s. It is fantastic. And it's about Doctor Doom and him being Doctor Doom in the future, in the cyberpunk future. Although he fights against other bad guys in that, which is interesting.
Oh, there you go. I mean, the concept of an anti-hero also is
Yeah.
a thing that I think quite a lot of D&D characters might fall into that kind of category.
Yeah.
So, there's another kind of way. The way I've played a villain in the party would probably be closest to the spy way, where basically what happened was my character, who was a bard, who was a stage magician, which is a lot more difficult to make money off in a world where actual magic also exists.
Yeah.
But somehow he was managing it. He was a tiefling stage magician, but he disguised himself as a human in acts. Died. But the place where he died, which the party then ran away from because they were outnumbered and outgunned, had a doppelganger in it. And so the DM comes to me and he's like, hey, do you want to play this doppelganger? And I'm like, well, what would I have to do? And he's like, well, you would have to pretend to be yourself. You can't really have your old powers, so you would have to find some way of like hiding that fact. And you would have to betray the party and lead them into the trap. And I'm like, fuck yeah, I want to be a doppelganger.
Yeah.
So I was like the doppelganger who was pretending to be him but couldn't cast any of his spells, so he's just being kind of useless in combat. And then I led them into this enemy lair and then sneaked away during my watch and came back with like a load of spiders and bugbears and stuff and tried to murder them all. I don't think I succeeded in killing a single one of them, which was unfortunate, but I think once we left off, like I had shapeshifted into another character and they were completely like none the wiser.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Which was amusing. Of course, in terms of like characters forcibly being turned into villains, like through some corrupting influence, generally in that case, the DM will take the character away from you, and they are considered dead until they're cured, if that is indeed possible. I've seen that happen as well.
I know that can happen in the Dresden Files role-playing game. What a weird one to bring up at this time. But yeah, that can happen. Yeah. If you've read the Dresden Files, you'll probably be able to guess under what circumstances that happens.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I imagine it probably happens in the Dragon Age tabletop role-playing game as well. To mages who.
Yeah, it must do. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll happen. I mean, D&D has an equivalent concept with warlocks and wild magic sorcerers.
Yeah.
I've not heard of that happening, but I presume from the flavor of the characters that it must do at some point.
Yeah.
So, what else? Be careful with revealing the villains for villains' sake that you've allowed in your world, because you can very quickly fuck that up.
Yeah.
For instance, you folks, Beth and the other people in her party, you've met Skedrenth.
Yes.
Who is the closest thing that Dawn Somber has to essentially Satan.
Yeah.
And he was a pretty chill guy, aside from that inconveniencing that he inconvenienced.
He was. I mean,
which is not really what I wanted to go for, to be honest. And I might try and retcon that particular aspect of his personality.
Yeah, I mean, he was a bit of a dick, but other than that, fairly okay. Like, I mean, in a weird way, I found his interactions with Zetchiundite a little bit comical and quite endearing, which...
Yeah, because like Zetchiundite's like, this is my plane, so just sort of fuck off out of it now.
Go away, like, get out my room, yeah.
Of the two, Skedrenth is probably the more powerful, but because he's not in his own plane, his powers are severely limited, so that might be why he switched over to just being sort of a comical character, in that he couldn't really do a huge amount in somebody else's plane.
Yeah.
But even so, it's like, I don't really want this guy to be a figure of fun, given that he's the manifestation of neutral evil, at least.
Yeah. I mean, Satan, in any universe, your in-universe Satan should kind of be a big deal. Unless you're going for a good guy Satan kind of thing.
You could also go for good guy Satan, but no, Skedrenth is like, basically... Skedrenth is the only one of the Meslinian gods who all cultures across Dawn Somber recognize as existing, even if they, like, don't recognize him as a god.
Yeah.
Because all of them are like, no, Skedrenth is the Lord of Demons.
Yeah.
He controls like 60 to 70% of all the demons and devils in like the demon plane. He's like, obviously, the Messalinians are like, he's a god, he's just a dick god, and the elves are like, no, he's a demon because the gods are dead, and the Varasians are like, you're both right, like there is no difference between gods and demons, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And also we're all terrified of them. But the thing about Skedrenth is that, like, if you don't have a good handle on characters like him, of what essentially the avatar of evil should be, you're gonna fuck it up.
Mm.
So maybe it's good to have those people as gods because then they don't turn up a huge amount.
Mm.
But
I mean,
made a mistake.
with gods you can kind of get away with it sometimes because they're, in a way, they're abstract concepts made
Well,
real.
that's why they are good for like creating blank morality
Yeah.
beings, just because they're that concept of morality made real. So obviously everything they create is a sort of agent of that cartoonishly
Yeah.
forward concept. Just like Sheogorath in the Elder Scrolls.
Yeah. I mean, I guess this is like pantheons generally in Western made-up ones for fiction generally, because even if you look at Norse mythology, like I could go on about the satanification of Loki forever and tell you how horribly wrong you are.
Mm. The foils. This is another thing. We should talk about the foils.
I love the foils.
The foils are so. I've talked about the City Port of Tarn before on the podcast. When Beth and company were playing the City Port of Tarn, they played the Vesasak side of the quest, which meant that they got the foils, which is this sort of equivalent party. You know that episode of The Simpsons where like Bart is trying to save Itchy and Scratchy
I
because he
knew this was going to be the
accidentally
one you talked about.
because he accidentally got the studio shut down by getting the original creator of the um, uh, property like compensation, and then like somebody who looks sort of like an off-model Bart actually does it instead.
Yeah.
Like this is that's what that's what the foils are. I believe it's happened to the characters from Scooby-Doo at least once as well. But the foils were a group of 4 adventurers. There was a tiefling fighter,
Mm.
an elf ranger who dual wielded, a halfling bard, and an orc warlock who were supposed to be like the weird foils to you guys.
Yeah.
And they were the Linelesian group.
Yeah.
And they were antagonists, but they were not bad
Not
guys.
bad
Like they
people.
genuinely believed that what they were doing was just and right and good.
I mean, judging by the amount of people that Jay's eaten, I would say that they're actually probably morally much more good. I mean, we have a pirate on our team, a were
Yeah, I
spider.
mean, she's an anti-slavery pirate, but she's still a
It's
pirate.
true, yeah.
Yeah, you have a pirate, a were-spider, a potential terrorist, and Silas.
Silas.
I mean, it's... Oh no, you were the bad guys all along.
But it was very interesting because again, you had that, you know, when a bard fights a bard, and at the garden party there was this showdown where we played our instruments at each other antagonistically.
It was very amusing.
Yeah, and I think even now, Jay's sort of still kind of like trying to start this friendly rivalry.
Iran and Cole.
Yes.
Tying villains into the personal stories of player characters. That is a thing you can do, and indeed, I believe that it is a thing that, if possible, you should do.
All of
At least once, because that story is already written for you.
Yeah.
Like, you can slot that villain in, and then suddenly you have an excellent reason why that villain exists, why they're doing what they're doing, and why the party are concerned with them at all.
And it will also help, I think, especially if you have a player who doesn't get the spotlight very often because maybe their player's a bit more shy or the character's a bit more 2D than others. To give that player room for growth and development as well, and give that.
I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
like try and gauge whether that would go down well.
Yeah,
If you
yeah,
have like a really nervous new player,
Yeah.
then giving them their own villain who's focused on ending them specifically might not be
Yeah, but I
the
mean,
best
if
idea.
it's something they've came up with themselves, like, oh, my parents were killed in a back alley by this man, and I never found out who he was. And then, surprise, you introduced them as a character. It's like, I must get revenge on my parents.
For my parents.
For my parents, not on my parents. Although, also a good motivation if their parents weren't very nice people.
True. So that was what we did with Iron and Cole, who was Marion's mother's first mate.
Yeah.
And who has turned against her and wanted to kill her because he was in the service of Galliena. And as soon as this dude turns up, we're like, okay, well, this is the reason why he's here, and he wants this thing, and the reason he knows Marion has it is because he has some connection to her past.
Yeah.
So that's a really good way to like put a villain into your setting without too much work, and it also like provides immediate relevance to the players, which is important, I think. I think variety in your villains is important because if you have the same villain or proxies for the same villain just doing the same thing over and over again, that's quickly going to become boring for your players, and it also means that they're not going to pay a huge amount of attention to any particular villain. A good way to differentiate your villains is to have them be very physically different and have different abilities, as well as like having different motivations.
I mean, that's basically what comic books do. The Riddler, very different from the Joker. The Joker, very different from Mr. Freeze. Mr. Freeze, very different from Catwoman.
It is for this exact reason that I asked Beth to be on the podcast in the first place, because of her extensive knowledge of the way that comic books work. Anyway, we seem like we're kind of just rambling now.
Yeah.
So House of Bards is filmed before a dead studio audience. Your hosts were Alex
and Beth.
The music was by Kevin MacLeod, and the cover art was by, I guess, whoever did the production stills for the 1960s Adam West Batman TV show.
Could it have been Warner Brothers? Have they owned Batman that long?
I don't know. I'm not sure. In any case, this image is in the public domain, which obviously it would have to be if we're using it.
Yeah.
So please don't come after us, whoever owns this IP now, because you snooze, you lose.
Yep.
There's no copyright on that image.
Yep.
Any other image of these characters that we use probably does have copyright on it, in which case please do come and get us.
Yeah.
But no, this one in particular is absolutely fine.
Yeah, and if you do challenge us, we vote trial by combat, and we will fight Dan Didio to the death.
Wow, that's another person that Beth is going to fight on top of literally Shakespeare.
Literally Shakespeare, Dan Didio.
Yeah.
Probably Rob Liefeld. Come at me.
I honestly would not begrudge you fighting Rob Liefeld. That's entirely reasonable to me.
I mean, I personally think I've said this before. Shakespeare would kick my ass, right? Because
you'd have to fight smart to deal with Shakespeare. Yeah. I think that you could win, but only if you're on the ball all the way.
Yeah, I think Dan Didio. I feel like Dan Didio probably like walks around with like a utility belt like Batman. I think that might be difficult.
I have every confidence in your ability to kick Rob Liefeld's ass.
I think I could do that, yeah.
I worry about Warner Brothers lawyers because there might be a lot of them at once.
That's true, yeah.
So be careful there.
It'd be like that scene in Kill Bill, except the Crazy 88 are all Warner Brothers lawyers, and they're all like spouting like legal jargon at me, and I'm just like dodging out of the way, like I didn't go to law school, back off.
I didn't see Kill Bill
either. You didn't see Kill Bill, that's okay.
I don't watch films a lot, so there's a whole like load of like films, just classic cinema that I haven't watched.
If you have any films to recommend to Alex to watch,
I probably won't watch them, but you're entirely free to recommend them to me. My Twitter is Cleaver Crummish. That is spelt clever crumb, like a crumb of bread ish, and that is my Tumblr as well. And Beth,
if you have any recommendations for who I should fight, my Twitter is @BaronessBamf, and that's also my Tumblr. Don't recommend people for me to fight on Tumblr. Just talk to me normally on Tumblr. But and I think that should be everything. So I guess I'll talk to you next week, Alex, and I hope they all listen to us next week as well. Hopefully,
Hopefully, I have no idea what we're going to talk about next week.
Hopefully, I won't have lost my fight with Dan Didio and all of Warner Brothers lawyers.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have any suggestions as to what subjects we could cover on the podcast, then feel free to leave a comment on our Twitters, on our Tumblrs, in the hashtag, in the comments below the video version. That's cool as well. I get email notifications for those, so I will see your comment, and I will probably pass it on to Beth if it's something pertaining to Beth. Although, as we've just mentioned, you could contact Beth directly and cut out the middleman.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways that you can reach us to talk about this podcast and the stuff that we do and the games that we run. So have a nice one, and we will see you next week.
Next week. Bye.
Bye. Look, if it's going to be inconvenient for you to fight Dan Didio and all of Warner Brothers lawyers in between us recording episodes of the podcast, then I just don't think it's an appropriate use of your time.
I mean, it really depends on where the fight's going to be scheduled.
What if you use your powers of trickery to make Dan Didio fight Warner Brothers lawyers?
That would be good.
That solves two problems.
Yeah.
I think we're overthinking this.
Yeah.